Park, and features 3 presenters, Pam Elam, Colleen Jenkins, and Meredith Bergman. There will be a Q&A at the end of the overall presentation. Please feel free to type in your questions as we go along in the Q&A function or at the end, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And now I'd like to introduce each of our speakers. First, we will hear from Pam Elam, president of Monumental Women, a not-for-profit that conceived and funded the Women's Rights Monument with the initial goal of breaking the bronze ceiling in Central Park by creating the first statue of real-life women in the park's 167th history. Pam is a retired attorney and feminist activist who has worked for both women's and LGBT rights throughout her career. She received both her undergraduate degree in political science and a law degree from University of Kentucky before moving to New York to pursue her master's degree in women's history from Sarah Lawrence College. Since then, she has continued her activism through award-winning projects promoting women's visibility and feminist causes by working in various capacities for New York City's government. Our next presenter, Colleen Jenkins, is the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's also a legislator, author, and television producer. She has co-authored a book, 33 Things Every Girl Should Know About Women's History, and produced the television documentary, An American Revolution, Women Take Their Place. Colleen is also the co-founder and president of the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Trust, a lending collection of 3,000 objects of women's suffrage memorabilia. Our final presenter is Meredith Bergman, who was chosen by Monumental Women out of 91 submissions from professional artists all over the country to create the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument. Meredith created a bold 3-woman statue, which includes suffragists Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth. For over 40 years, Meredith has been making sculpture that with complex themes in an accessible, beautiful, and provocative way, with the capacity to make the past speak to the present. Will you please now welcome our first presenter, Pam Elam.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here, and we're happy to discuss Monumental Women. We're very proud that our all-volunteer, not-for-profit group has broken the bronze ceiling in New York City's Central Park. It took 7 years. We raised over $1.5 million in private funding. We fought through many obstacles, but on August 26th, the centennial anniversary of the ratification and certification of the 19th Amendment, we unveiled our Women's Rights Pioneers Monument, honoring Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I think you may be seeing a slide showing the site that we fought so hard for on Literary Walk, but we can go back just to the main screen, please. The problem of trying to get this done, you're seeing lots of different slides now flashing. You'll see a couple that I'll talk about later that involve the process, and I'm speaking and Meredith speaking before certain bureaucratic entities, and then the unveiling ceremony, and now there's the lovely shot of the statue itself. But the long and short of it is, after 167 years, finally, thanks to Monumental Women, there is a statue of real women in Central Park. 42 million people who visit Central Park each year already see Alice in Wonderland, Mother Goose, Juliet with Romeo, of course, as well as allegorical figures, nymphs and angels. Now they can see some real monumental women. And I'm especially pleased to report that the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument has already become an important must-see location. As one of our supporters put it, the statue is a living place. People send us selfies of themselves and their friends and their families at the monument. They explain to their children what the monument means. Thousands of people have accessed our app, Talking Statues, to hear the words of Truth, Anthony, and Stanton while they view the images of those women. And you can also get that if you just want to check our website, monumentalwomen.org. But recently, the statue has also become a site where people have left banners, photos, and flowers in honor of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But creating the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument is only one of the goals of Monumental Women. In addition, we seek to create an awareness and appreciation of women's history through our education campaign and through our challenge to municipalities all across the nation and the world to reimagine their public spaces and include more tributes to women and people of color. It was a roller coaster ride through the New York City bureaucracy to get this done, as we were discussing a little bit ago. Because in addition to our challenge to municipalities across the country and across the world, little did we know that we would have to challenge our own municipality as well. So that roller coaster ride went through the Parks Department, the Central Park Conservancy, the Public Design Commission, the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and every single community board surrounding Central Park. Some of the slides you may have seen do reference some of those appearances before some of those boards. But step by step, meeting by meeting, we crossed the minefield that was New York City government and is New York City government to win all the approvals necessary. New York City, as you may know, has 150 statues in its public spaces. Only 5 of those are women. Now, thanks to Monumental Women, there are 6. It's a beginning. There will be more statues to come. You can guarantee that. Monumental Women has a number of goals, which not only include building new statues, but also providing books on women's history to the public school libraries in New York City, creating a 5-borough women's history trail so that all of New York City can be included, not just Manhattan. And many other projects that you'll hear about, including a toolkit for communities who want to build statues on their own. So maybe in the Q&A, we can talk a little bit about that. But just to give you a quick snapshot of one agency and the roadblocks in that agency, I just want to talk a little bit about the Parks Department. When we first sent our letter of intent into the Parks Department, and if any of you ever want to donate a work of art to New York City, that is the first step. Go on the Parks Department website, and it's a how-to, including send a letter of intent to start the ball rolling. So after we did that and waited 9 months on them to give us a meeting, we were told immediately by the Parks Department and the Central Park Conservancy that there would never be another new statue in Central Park. They said it was a historical collection and nothing would ever be changed about that. We persisted because we knew that wasn't written anywhere. It wasn't a law, it wasn't a regulation, and it was, as they term it, an unwritten moratorium. So you challenge every step of the way. So we got past that. And then they said, well, are you sure you want Central Park? How about another park? And are you sure you want a statue? How about a nice garden? We persisted. Then a new commissioner came in, Commissioner Mitchell Silver, and found out about what was going on and said, well, there are no statues of real women in Central Park. Well, let's create an exception so they can try and get theirs done, with a whole long list of things that we had to do in order to achieve that goal. So we were grateful for that and moved forward to start achieving all of the criteria listed for us. And then, even though we had the okay to have a statue, it was only outside the walls of Central Park. Every site they showed us was outside the wall. We said, no, absolutely not. It has to be in Central Park. That's the whole point. They were saying, well, you know, the sidewalk is technically part of the footprint of Central Park. No, we persisted, and we got that beautiful site that you saw on the first slide on Literary Walk. Finally, just the last thing I wanted to let you know, just to give you an idea of some of the things that come at you when you wanted to do a project like this. They said that we should prove that all of these women had actually been in Central Park. Nobody doing a statue in Central Park in the whole history of the park ever had to prove that the people they were honoring had actually set foot in the park. But we did. And luckily, I knew where to find the material, and I knew the answers to the question. And Sojourner Truth lived in New York City even before Central Park was created. So there's that. And Susan Anthony loved walking in Central Park. Stanton, in her younger years, played with her children there. And in her later years, took carriage rides through the park. So nothing was too large or too small for us to try and prove and meet the criteria. But we're all about moving history forward. So we kept things moving. And we're all about creating this monument as an instant history lesson. It's an examination, really, of how social change comes about. It's learning from the past to do a better job of fighting for equality and justice in the future. It's challenging municipalities to reflect and respect all of us in our public spaces. And it's about completing the journeys toward justice of all the valiant women who came before us and achieving full equality for women in our lifetimes. Anyone who works for social change is very familiar with the concept of reinventing the wheel. It simply means doing what others have already done because you didn't know that they'd done it. Had you known, you might have learned from it and done things differently. To me, that's what learning about history is all about. And for women and people of color, it has a special significance because so much of our history has been hidden from us and only been brought to light in recent decades through the wonderful work of feminist historians and activists and scholars. Learning from a history which fully and fairly includes the vast and various contributions of women and people of color offers a departure point in our search for social change. We rethink the past to reshape the future. As we all know, through the gift of women's history, we discover an historic treasure chest overflowing with the stories of women who serve to inspire and energize us. We learn of their strategies and tactics in the fight for equality. We learn of their courage and their imperfections. We look at the totality of their lives. We build on their work. We honor their memories. We vow to complete their journeys. We begin to move history forward. It's not easy and it's not always welcomed, but we keep moving, not as far or as fast as we would like to, but the fight continues because we all know, that a knowledge of women's history helps us understand the context of the struggle for equality, as well as the continuum of the fight for justice. That knowledge makes us better advocates and better activists. Of course, one main obstacle, again, as we all know, to the forward movement is, as the great activist Robin Morgan has named it, historical illiteracy. It's absolutely shocking to find through surveys and other research data how little people actually know about history in general and about women's history and the history of people of color specifically. Misinformation, however, is in constant supply. There are many ways to increase the knowledge of women's history in the community as well as in the classroom. And I know that many of you in the audience today have done and are doing just that. So thank you for such wonderful work to correct the historical record and to create new ways for all people to learn from it. In whatever ways we can honor the valiant women who came before us, let's do that. Not everybody can spend 7 years of her life trying to get a statue built or have a historic home recognized. But how about a street sign? How about a garden, a plaque where she lived or where she made history, or any number of other tributes that are possible? Who knows how many people will walk by that tribute and be inspired by that woman? Who knows how many little girls and boys will gain a new role model? Who knows how many of us will see that tribute and feel a new sense of energy and activism? It's fitting that the first statue of real women in Central Park depicts 3 New York women who dedicated their lives to fighting for women's rights. They were contemporaries. They often spoke on the same stages, attended the same meetings. It's only fitting that they share the same pedestal. And the statue conveys the power of women working together to bring about revolutionary change in our society. It invites people to reflect not just on these women and their work, but all monumental women that we know about. Some we may never know, but it won't be because we didn't try to find them. It's not often that you have the chance to be a part of something that's truly historic. And at Monumental Women, we're proud that our Women's Rights Pioneers Monument will be making a lasting statement to all future visitors in Central Park, a message written in stone and shaped in bronze that equality applies to everyone. And now I pass the baton to Colleen Jenkins.
Hi, Pam, and hi, audience. Thank you very much, Pam. I quite enjoyed a review of the past 7 years. What I'd like to do, I am the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I welcome you to my home and to my family. I'd like to introduce you to Elizabeth Cady Stanton as most people know her. She had a daughter, Harriet, who was a big New York State suffrage organizer. And this is Harriet's daughter, Nora, who is my grandmother. And the reason I show you these 3 people is to understand the suffrage movement is really 3 generations, because whereas she grew up in a soup of law as a young person, it took 3 generations for the amendment of the US Constitution to take place. So what I'd like to say is 7 years ago, I got a phone call from somebody called Gary Ferdman, and he asked me a question. Do I know anything about Elizabeth Cady Stanton? I said, yes, I do. I listened to his pitch. They're going to put a statue in Central Park. And I said, I know something about putting statues in places. I was involved with the suffragists in the Capitol Rotunda. So as always, I say, yes, if you need help, I am here. What I want to know is, I want you to know by focusing on one person, is that this is about women's rights pioneers, women's rights. What I want to do is flash back to Elizabeth when she was young. She grew up in a soup of law. All around her was law, 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 law. And if you want to understand how she connected women in law, this is part of the story behind the statues, the 3 figures in the statue, but also the whole social movement that was called the world's greatest bloodless revolution. 51% of the population came in. According to the US Constitution, of course, it's not a light switch that you go on and off, but to have that embedded in the US Constitution, the right to vote, is what we're celebrating this year, the 100th anniversary. But to get to 1920, it took three generations. So I just want you to know that Elizabeth has, her father's a judge, women are knocking at the door, wanting to see the lawyer, going away distraught. Just to give you an example, here's a coral necklace. It's Elizabeth's. She got it as a Christmas present. A law clerk in the home of Judge Katie said, "You see that necklace? Who owns it?" She said, "I own it." And he said, "Well, when you get married, your husband can swap it for a cigar and it will go up in smoke. That is the law." So it takes time to change the position of women. They didn't own the back, the clothes on their back. They didn't own their children. If they went to, they didn't own their wages. They couldn't serve, they couldn't vote. They couldn't serve on a jury. They couldn't, you just name it, couldn't run for office. They were compelled to obey laws in which they had no voice in forming those laws. So that's what we're talking about, is a transition from the early 1800s to 1920, when the primary vote is given or granted by the 19th Amendment of the US Constitution. Of course, we know that that's a right to vote. That's not a guarantee of all of the other rights. So what happened is on Elizabeth's honeymoon, she goes to London, not Niagara Falls, London, with her abolitionist attorney husband, to the first anti-slavery conference, first World Anti-Slavery Conference. And guess what the first order of business was? It had nothing to do with slavery, abolishing it. It had to do with whether women at the convention, including the female delegates from America, should vote or not vote. And the decision was, no, women shall not have a voice here. So Stanton meets Lucretia Mott, and together they say, we need to work on women's rights. And when we return to America, that's what we'll do. And they fast forward to 1848, and that is the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls. They write their Declaration of Independence, their grievances. But one of the things that was very controversial was the proposal for elective franchise, the vote. 1848, the vote for women. And it narrowly passed. Stanton spoke for it. I just want you to know another person spoke for it, Frederick Douglass. Those two people were adamant about the vote as full citizenship. So this is the whole point: women's rights. They're needed, they're necessary. So this is now a 3-generation effort, and you do not change the Constitution easily. You need 75% of the states ratifying an amendment. That's enormous. And Edith Mayo of the Smithsonian basically said, this is the largest bestowal of democratic freedoms in the history of the United States. It impacted 51% of the population, women, but quite truthfully, it's not just an amendment to the Constitution that affects women. It affects all citizens. I want to read it. The 19th Amendment, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Isn't that timely? We're 2 weeks before an election. Isn't that timely? We're still fighting for this. Nothing's like a light switch. You have rights, you don't have rights. Everything's an evolution. So I've told you only about one person in the statue. There are 2 other people, Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth had a 50-year relationship of fighting for the vote and other rights. As well, I have a nice personal story. Sojourner Truth, when she was at one of the last women's rights conventions at Cooper Union, in New York City. Well, my great grandmother, as a child, had the job of reading the newspapers. So when Sojourner Truth was staying at Elizabeth Cady Stanton's home, sure enough, Harriet was reading the newspaper for Sojourner Truth. And this is a firsthand incident of how cooperative and how they shared not only meetings, but shared a personal aspect of their lives. As long as we're on the topic of who, I think this statue campaign has been really fun, because when you're talking about rights of citizens, it's a magnet to really interesting people. It's a bandwagon, and I'm happy to have been on it with thousands of other people. For instance, Pam has described how she's lent her incredible talents, not only in New York City government, but also in New York State government. And soon you will hear from Meredith, who's lent her artistic talents. Among other things, she's done a woman's statue up in Boston. But I would like to also acknowledge some of the other people that came on for the same reasons. For instance, I went to hear Commissioner Mitchell Silver when he gave his first public talk as being commissioner for New York State. His talk started out, "The mayor and I believe in equality and equity." So I fell in love with this guy. His speech continued. He talked about all sorts of equalities, but he never mentioned gender. And so I went up to him and I said, "There's a gender problem in Central Park." He said, "I didn't know it." And he investigated it. And sure enough, there's this moratorium on no new statues. What, we're going to stay stagnant in the past? Well, how about having an irrefutable argument that women are part of this nation? We've built the nation. We have equal rights. We demand them. And we had an irrefutable argument that Central Park is a quintessential public forum. You cannot leave women out. And we live in the 21st century. So we must rectify it with this monument. So I just think it's really interesting how many people jumped on board about this thing. For instance, we needed a project manager to oversee this. What's more complicated than trying to do architecture in New York City? So a project manager came out of Bayer Blinder Bell, and they, in an email I probably wasn't supposed to read, but it said, "We don't do small projects like that. But because of its importance, we're taking it on." So this phenomenal architectural firm that's done the renovation of Grand Central Station, Lincoln Center, JP Morgan Library, they took on our little tiny project because of its importance and significance. So then how about the Girl Scouts? Several troops got involved, and they are just unbelievable. Everything they say is pithy, and they are absolute media magnets. So having an organization that has 2.3 million Girl Scouts is a wonderful idea. And after all of us will not exist in a few decades. So we need to have succession built in. And then a strange thing happened because of Pam Elam's article in the West Side Rag. She caught the attention of the president of New York Life Foundation. And that person went to the CEO of New York Life and said, "This project's great because we have a strong tie to Susan B. Anthony." She asked for 300,000 and she got a no. No. He said, "We're doing 500,000, which certainly helped with fundraising. Of course, we had Girl Scout cookie money, and we had major benefactors as well. So I want to summarize that this statue has a symbolic value. It's not just bronze, it's a symbolic value of the vote. And the vote is the public voice. Also, I feel strongly that the voice is great, the vote is great, but our other rights are not guaranteed. And out of this very long journey, I want to show you a stamp behind me. This is a stamp that the US Postal Service just issued. And God knows where all these videos go. They go out into the ether. And so shortly after that showed up, that video that I did for them, I got a handwritten note from the archivist of the United States, thanking for our celebration of the 19th Amendment. And this is just the person I want to hear from, because his job description is to publish, that's the verb, publish an amendment to the US Constitution when 38 states have ratified that amendment. So if that would be the 28th Amendment. So that was formerly called the Equal Rights Amendment. So I see this as a huge arc from demanding the vote to amending the Constitution to the Voting Rights Acts in the 1960s, because Congress shall enforce their articles. And then we're going into a very exciting period of a guarantee of equal rights. So I would like to say thank you to the Hydra. What's a Hydra? It's an organism that has lots of different heads, and every head has its own capability. And together we move forward with a better nation. And now I'd like to turn it over to Meredith, the sculptor.
Hi, Colleen. Thank you. And thank you to the library, and thank you to Pam for that wonderful speech as well. I'm going to turn over my screen to slides and talk about how the monument was created. At first, a little bit conceptually, and then actually how it was created physically. So bear with me for a moment as I share my screen. Yeah, here we go. Okay. And then play. All right, here's the Central Park Mall. It has a kind of living architecture. It was designed to be almost an outdoor cathedral, in that there are trees like pillars, very precious American elm trees that are very much protected by the fence and by constant care. And they proceed in 2 rows, one just inside the fence and the other beyond. And then between them are pairs of statues. And Literary Walk has 2 Scottish poets, Robbie Burns, Looking to Heaven. And these statues have a kind of vocabulary, which was common in 19th century art and all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. So a thinker or a philosopher or writer was usually shown seated, the better to think, and with objects around him that symbolized what he was famous for. Burns has a plow down between his feet that's supposed to remind people that his father was a farmer, and a scroll with one of his poems written on it that became a song. And he's holding a pen. And across from him is Sir Walter Scott, who has an absolutely marvelous dog and is also holding paper and pen. And then as you proceed north on Literary Walk, you come to Fitzgreen Halleck, who was very popular in his time. 10,000 people came to the unveiling of this statue, but I have yet to find anyone alive who reads him. Now, across from him, for the last 144 years, has been nothing. And that is the site that Monumental Women was granted for this statue. And here are Anthony and Stanton. They had, as Colleen said, a long collaboration, friendship, many fights. They worked together and they were quite complementary. They were very different women. Stanton had 7 children. Anthony never married. Stanton was tied down at home. Anthony could travel. I asked Colleen in this photo, which I love, and here they are working together, sharing attention. I asked her why Stanton had chains printed on her dress, why that fabric? And Colleen said, oh, she was always messaging. And that kind of set me free to think about the level of detail in my sculptures and how I could embed symbolism throughout them, including in the dress patterns. And here is Sojourner Truth, also holding papers. Although she was illiterate, she was very, very well informed. And she was a marvelous speaker. She became a famous orator. And here she is photographed by Matthew Brady, famous photographer from the Civil War, wearing a lovely brocade jacket and a silk shawl with long fringes. And that's part of what her costume is based on for the statue. One note about 19th century photography, it was not candid, it was not casual, it was posed, and it's often such high contrast that you can't, for instance, make out what kind of hat she's wearing. Here is Stanton as an older woman in a kind of guise. Once her hair went white, she would dress this way as an eminently respectable grandmother, and then she would start to speak and people would be absolutely shocked because she would talk about divorce or maybe even free love, and certainly more rights for women than anyone could imagine someone like this talking about. But I wanted to show her and Anthony at a younger age, at the height of their collaboration before the Civil War. And these are daguerreotypes that Colleen showed me of Stanton as a younger woman, as a mother, with some of her 7 children. And here's Susan B. Anthony. We don't often think of her with dark hair. Here she is somewhere in middle age, I think about 40. And again, I wanted to show her a little younger. She was 5 years younger than Stanton. Perhaps not this young. Here she is in her 30s. Oh, this photo shows a hint of a smile. And again, we don't think of her smiling. She looks almost like an eagle in most representations, very fierce and somewhat grim. And she wasn't. She was evidently very genial and very warm. But in these posed photographs, this is the kind of facial expression you often get. So one thing a sculptor has to do is imagine how to bring these faces to life for us now. Sojourner Truth had a very interesting relationship with photography. As an ex-slave and someone who had essentially freed herself, walked off the master's farm in upstate New York before legally she was freed, although after her master had agreed to free her and then rescinded. She was among the first to copyright her own image and sell photographs of herself for profit to survive. So in a sense, she was reinforcing the way in which she owned herself now. And they always bore this slogan, I sell the shadow to support the substance. And in this photo, you see clearly that she's holding her knitting. And that was very important. Here she is again, actually displaying the knitting. It was not a hobby. It was a patriotic duty for middle-class women. And it was a skill not usually taught to enslaved people. So it was part of her image as a free person. Okay, now the actual creation of the sculpture, I'm getting ahead of myself here. This was our house. This is my studio before we bought the house. It's a sunroom. And we bought our house in Ridgefield mainly because it has this room, which is about 18 by 20 feet. It has an 11-foot ceiling with a skylight. And this was how it looked. And then I converted it to a studio. I painted it white and eventually covered the stone floor. Here you see, before I began this project, in the center on a cart is a maquette for another monument with little tiny figures. And that's usually how I begin, working in miniature, to think through the overall design of something at a kind of architectural scale. And there's a piece on the easel and various other pieces around. So to begin sculpting monumental figures, after you have worked at this very small scale, and that's the scale that goes through the approvals process, you begin to enlarge to an interim height. Now, Susan B. Anthony in the park is 9 feet tall, 1.75 times life size. And you can't jump up from something where 1 inch equals 1 foot, almost like a Barbie doll, to something 9 feet high. You have to have an interim size. So here is the 3 foot high model. And I begin with the skeleton, I add musculature, and then I begin to work with models. And here I am talking with models and an assistant about what the pose might mean and how they're interacting. And here are my 2 models. And you can see that it was very helpful to have them working. This was the 2 figures of Stanton and Anthony at 1/3 height. The next step is to have figures scanned. And this gentleman this is not a piece of dental equipment. This is actually the scanner, recording information from every angle into a laptop computer, and then that was sent to a facility in New Jersey where they milled with huge industrial milling machines, a very high density foam, and that was then delivered in pieces. So here's the studio with these dollies that have been used for many other projects, ready for the delivery. And this is Susan B. Anthony's skirt. This is the lower part of her body, being brought down off the truck. It weighed, I think, 400 pounds. This is without any clay on it, and it was heavy. And the only way to get it into my studio was to bring it around the house, in through the living room, up 3 steps through the kitchen, and then down into the studio. And when the next figure was delivered, we actually found a better way. Here are some of the sections. You see they're very crude. And in fact, I ended up remaking the hands from scratch. And here are the different stages. On the right is Stanton in the raw foam, just delivered. And in the center is Anthony with clay, a layer of clay over most of the figure, although one of her arms has not been attached yet. The hands I kept as removable, and the heads also, so I could bring them down, put them on a table and work on them. And then in the foreground is the 1/3 height model, and you see that the figure of Sojourner Truth has only just begun. But here I am finishing it. And here we have the 1/3 height model photographed from below. And I was always trying to see it as if it were already in the park at full scale. So this is one of the factors in jumping from the 1/3 height to the full height, trying to see it from the right angle. When you actually work on the large things, you find out what you really have. And in fact, I decided that Anthony's neck was too long, and I had to cut a slice out of it and bring her head closer to her shoulders, because I had raised it in the 1/3 height model and it just didn't work at full scale. So I spent a lot of time up on ladders. Here are the removable heads, and you see on the table reference photos of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, chosen for their expression, the facial expression. Although they're very different ages, and I was really trying to arrive at her face from this composite of photos. Okay, Sojourner Truth came in through the front door, but actually, because she was in life 6 feet tall and very bony, the figure of her seated was narrower and could fit in this way. And here, my assistant Emily is in the foreground putting clay on the skirt of Sojourner Truth. Patrick is in the middle building a little triangular platform to put under Susan B. Anthony's foot. long story. And I'm in the background carving down Sojourner Truth's hat from the back, because when enlarged, the folds in the hat were too regular and they looked kind of like stripes on a melon or a pumpkin. It didn't look like fabric. And here Patrick and I are putting finishing touches on the full size composition. Each figure is on its own dolly. Oh, there's the little triangular platform. It was for the table, actually. Okay, so the table travels with Stanton. Sojourner Truth is on her own dolly, but we were able to put them together the way they would be in bronze. And this is Pam arriving to see the full-scale statue for the first time, looking up. And actually, in order to see it the way you have to see it in the park, you really had to lie on the floor. So here I am with one of the architects from Beyer Bell looking up at the figures. And that day, the committee from Monumental Women did approve them, and I'm very happy. And the next day, this is the front hall of my house, which was the largest empty floor space. This is a template. What Patrick and I did was lay 8.5 by 11 paper all over those dollies in among the statues to record the space between the statues. And then we could use that almost like a dress pattern to make a template. So at the bronze foundry, they would place the statues in the right relationship to each other. So these little marks in the foreground are the spines of the books that will sit under Elizabeth Cady Stanton's chair. And I should have mentioned earlier with Fitzgreen Halleck, he has books under his chair. Burns has manuscripts next to his tree trunk. It's kind of another piece of this statue vocabulary to have the books for a writer. But we'll get to that. Okay, then the statues are cut up. The heads, Susan B. Anthony's handbag bursting with papers, the documents they're holding, the books, all went to New York City to be molded in the mold maker's workshop. And this is what my studio looked like for 6 weeks. This is the middle of the process of mold making, which is in 2 layers, a pink flexible rubber and then a rigid plaster jacket. And the statues are pretty heavily damaged. The clay originals are damaged in the process, but that's fine because the molds are then taken to the bronze foundry where melted wax is painted inside them. And here what they're trying to do is essentially what a chocolate factory would do for a chocolate rabbit. They're trying to make a hollow, positive version of the statue. So here's the wax room. On the right are heads of the women and the handbag. On the left are the books. And in the distance, you see Anthony's skirt again. And here's the skirt in the foreground. And I'm trying to hold Anthony's head up so as to show how her face would be shadowed in the park in the daylight. And you see Sojourner Truth's face with her eyeglasses on peeking out there. And here is Anthony cast in bronze, again, in pieces. So each section is welded together and then the welds are hidden with careful metalwork. And I have to be at the foundry to supervise that. And even last week when I was in the park, I could see where the weld was. I just hope nobody else can. But it's a very laborious process, very ancient process. It's fascinating, but it does take many people and many skills to make these things look like they're just standing there. Here's Sojourner Truth. You can see she's in sections also, the forearm at the knee, and her head is over there in a box. And I went to work on her finger. One of her right index finger was amputated while she was enslaved in some kind of agricultural accident, but it became a kind of a symbol of her slavery. And Susan B. Anthony used it in a speech. She referred to the scars on the back of Frederick Douglass and to Sojourner's hand as things that their masters had done to them. So it became a kind of political image, and it was very clear that it should be part of the statue. But in the casting, the scar got kind of messed up, so I'm filing back into that. Then when the statues are all assembled, all that metal work is hidden with a chemical patina. So here in 89-degree heat, Sarah May, who's actually project manager, not one of the patina people, is helping out because we were on such a tight deadline to heat the metal and paint on chemicals, acids, and pigments to color it a nice mustardy light brown, golden brown. And here's Sarah and Rosemary Rednor, who's the chief patina artist, and she's actually buffing away some of the patina. You can see on Anthony's brooch that it's got some highlights. And I would ask them to do the edges or the ruffle, and they would remove some of the patina. So every inch was again considered. This is the last day, the last few hours before the sculpture was supposed to be delivered. Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the right already has been waxed. So she has that high gleam and that rich, deep color. Meanwhile, the guys on the left are welding a panel on the underside of Sojourner Truth's chair, which had been left open. And of course, once the statue was 5 feet up in the air, you would have been able to see up inside and seen all the raw welding, and it would have kind of ruined the illusion that these were real women who just happened to be in bronze. Meanwhile, the patina is still in progress. And then the statue was delivered, installed onto the stone pedestal, which itself was a whole architectural project with huge underground foundations, very heavy, and unveiled. I love the purple drape and Pam giving a wonderful speech. And then here are Hillary Clinton and Pam and me having our moment in front of the statue. And here it is, and people have been leaving flowers on it. As Pam said, there's now a banner in front that says RIP RBG and more flowers. Okay, so details. Anthony is wearing a brooch in a cameo that shows Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom and strategy. And her handbag is sort of like the plow for Robbie Burns. It's her attribute. It identifies her. She carried this everywhere. It's sort of like a doctor's bag. And it became so famous that there was a children's jump rope rhyme about this alligator bag. And Stanton described it as being crammed with facts and injustices. And she would bring these to Stanton's house to work on speeches together. And we crammed it with a flyer for a women's rights convention at Cooper Union, a petition for universal suffrage, a petition to the legislature, and a flyer for a free lecture by Sojourner Truth. And here is Sojourner Truth wearing her brocade jacket, which has a pattern of laurel wreaths, which are an ancient symbol of oratory and victory, really. It was placed on the brows of poets and wonderful speakers. And here is her knitting in her lap. I actually had to knit a piece from bulky yarn from the Ridgefield yarn store, shellac it, paint it, and then embed clay in some of the deeper pits, and then that could be molded. There, my Girl Scout knitting skills came in very handy. Stanton is wearing a brooch that is a sunflower, and the pattern that we ended up with on her dress is little sunflowers that kind of radiate like novas. When she was very young, she began to publish editorials and letters in the local paper, and her parents, especially her father, would have been horrified and probably punished her, and she published them under the name Sunflower. And sunflowers later, through the state of Kansas, became an emblem for the suffrage movement. And here are the books that are under her chair. They are by four mothers of the women's rights movement. Mary Wollstonecraft, Sarah Grimke, and Margaret Fuller. So they span the 18th through 19th centuries. And then on the end there is the Declaration of Sentiments, which was the actual document from 1848, in which Stanton rewrote the Declaration of Independence to declare that all men and women are created equal. This is the Boston Women's Memorial, which is on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, another stretch that had statues all. And this was unveiled in 2003. And again, I was given 3 women from history to portray, but they were women who never met. And I treated them as portraits, but also as allegorical figures. So they represent 3 different creative temperaments, and this monument was meant to celebrate them as writers. So Lucy Stone is the activist. Abigail Adams in the center is the contemplative one who's looking back through history. And Phyllis Wheatley, the poet, is the figure of imagination. There are also 3 different ages: middle age, old age, and youth. But I couldn't show them together. It just didn't make any sense. So I created a space you can walk into where you assemble the conversation in your own mind. And I was really overjoyed that in Central Park, I could show these 3 women actually working together and create an image that I think people need to see now of 3 people of different races, different religions, different economic status, different educational backgrounds, working together to change the world. And now back to Lori. Okay, there we are.
I'd like to invite all of our panelists to come up for a Q&A. We're going to take a look at the Q&A. Are there any particular questions that anyone has for any of our presenters? We'll wait for a few minutes to see if some come in. I have a couple of questions. Meredith, this one's for you. How did you decide the ages of the women in the sculpture?
That's always a question. And I try when I'm doing a portrait to create a face that suggests their entire life. So I may include a wrinkle that they didn't actually have at that age, or a sweetness that is from their youth that they had lost by then. It was an issue back when I was doing Abigail Adams, who described herself after the death of her daughter by breast cancer, as being furrowed and ravaged and pitted with grief. And I didn't want to show that. So with Stanton and Anthony, I really wanted to show them at the height of their collaboration. While Stanton was still trapped in motherhood, you know, in a condition that contemporary women could relate to. Not that she didn't love having 7 children, she did, and she was enormously proud of them. I see Colleen smiling. But she wrote about pacing the room like a tigress and wanting to be free to go out and be an activist like Anthony. So I wanted to show them not in their most famous avatars as these old women with the snowy hair, but as younger women. Sojourner Truth was 20 years older than Susan B. Anthony. So she was already about 60 when these women were in their 40s. So that's kind of the ages that I chose. I forgot to mention that I also wanted to show them symbolically. So they represent 3 aspects of activism. Sojourner Truth is the speaker, the orator, and Anthony is the activist who goes out and organizes. And Stanton, who was really the philosopher of the women's movement and a very radical one, is writing. So these are three aspects.
Okay, we have a comment here that says, fabulous presentation, awesome accomplishment, beautiful, powerful, and meaningful sculpture.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I have another question for you, Meredith, which was the foam portion of this sculpture process. How does that, with the clay on top of it, how does it disappear in the foundry process?
It doesn't. The molds are made and then the molds are taken away. And at the foundry, the waxes are made. I still have these giant ruined foam things in my studio. and I'm going to have to cut them up to get them out of here. And I just haven't wanted to do that yet. But any week now I'm going to have to, so I can get to work on something new.
May I have a special request for you, Meredith.
Sure.
I would like to accession the stuff that you're throwing out of your studio. I would like to accession a piece of it for the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Trust collection of 3,000 objects. And if you could sign it and date it, I would appreciate it. But
Sure.
not the whole thing, just a portion, please.
Yes, I have an idea for something that won't bring a lot of muck and grease into your collection.
Well, how about a head or a hand?
Possibly. I'll look around.
Meredith,
I think the hands are in the basement.
I also want you to save something for
I would write this
Monumental
down.
Women and our archives. So we don't mean to add more work to your day, but we have to preserve these things and
Yes.
make sure that every single part of the journey is documented and respect our own history as well as the history of others.
Yes.
It looks like we have a couple more questions coming in. How does Meredith feel about face masks being put on her subjects?
Oh, I like it when people interact with the statues. In Boston, they're very accessible. You can walk up, sit with them, put your arm around them, and they haven't suffered very much. There's been some slight vandalism, but nothing really serious. And people do dress them and put,
Really?
Red Sox hats on them. The very first autumn, someone put a sweater on Lucy Stone. They put flowers. After the 2016 election, they put notes of apology under the hand of Lucy Stone where she's writing. They put the notes in her hand. And the I voted stickers on them, on Abigail Adams. And I found that incredibly moving. It's like the Ruth Bader Ginsburg memorial that's sprung up in Central Park. The Central Park monument you're not supposed to touch. It's behind a fence, it's on the grass, and the grass is protected to protect the elm trees. But I'm sure somebody's gonna climb up there at some point and put something on them. I wouldn't encourage it, but putting masks on the statues I think is kind of sweet.
I just wanted to comment on the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's very evocative, and contemporary people interact quite a bit. And I know that the objects that are left there are very carefully archived. So that I think is something for Monumental Women or Parks Department to do. For instance, the RGB RIP sign should be archived as part of the history of this statue.
I'd like to add a footnote about the care and maintenance of statues. One of the things that we had to do was provide a $100,000 endowment fund to the Central Park Conservancy for the continued care and maintenance of our monument. And also now, as of August 26th, it belongs to the city of New York. We have given it to the city of New York. So what we can or cannot do about it is not the same as before August 26th.
We have another question that's come up. Thank you. This is a wonderful talk. My question is, how did you decide who was going to sit and who was going to stand in the statue?
Well, in that early photograph of Stanton and Anthony, with Anthony standing and Stanton seated, it's just immediately interesting that they're different heights. And even though I was portraying them younger when Stanton was not so crippled by her own weight or whatever illness she had, and I think she had some kind of progressive illness because she got weaker, I wanted to show that they were complementary. So to have one standing and one seated made sense. And then with Sojourner Truth added, in part because she was so tall, she was almost 6 feet. Anthony was 5.5. Stanton was only 5 feet tall. So it made sense to have the two women who were most disparate in height seated. And then if you look at the statue, you'll see that even seated, Sojourner Truth is still very, very high. it's something that I think about all the time as a sculptor, how to create the most active composition in 3 dimensions also. So you'll see their hands are weaving among each other and their gestures are interweaving to make the whole thing come alive.
Okay, there's someone who wants to know what's the easiest way to get into Central Park to find your monument?
Well,
Well, here's the easiest way, if I may just
Please.
say, go to monumentalwomen.org. We have a map
yeah.
and directions. That's the easiest way.
Yes, but the mall is very central. If you find the Central Park Lake and Bethesda Terrace with the fountain with the angel who's so famous, running straight south from that is the Central Park Mall. And if you just walk down it, you will come to the statue. Or you can enter from about 68th Street on either side and just walk until you hit that mall. And you'll know it. It's
The
the
zoo
only straight
also.
path.
Can't you go in through the zoo and walk up,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is a nice way to enter?
Yeah.
From Paulette, we have excellent presentation. Paulette Ross and Suffrage Forward congratulate and thank you for breaking yet another ceiling.
May I say hello to Paulette Ross, who is part of our bandwagon. And the Suffrage Forward has been west of the Hudson, but since they're so competent with Zoom, they are accessible to the world. And they have very many creative people who have actually made a stunning souvenir of a handbag that is Suffrage Forward, and it is on both sides full of suffragists throughout the ages.
Yeah, it's nice.
Did someone find that handbag?
Excuse me?
How would someone find that handbag?
Well, Paulette Ross, Suffrage Forward. Let's see if she answers her own, answers your question on the Q&A.
Okay.
Oh, you just go to suffrageforward.org. Isn't that easy? Suffrageforward.org. I have bought 3 of them.
Sounds wonderful.
They're holiday presents.
Well, we're waiting for just a few more questions. Anyone else? We have some few comments in the chat and any additional questions?
I have a question for your audience. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sure. What attracted you to spend an hour on this beautiful day? What brought you to this Central Park statue? Is there some personal message you would like to share with us in Q&A? Ooh, silence is golden.
Yes. I think we have a shy audience.
I don't think so. Oh, there it is.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, how long did it take? I had 2 years to create this, which for me is very fast.
But Meredith, tell us about how many times you had to revise it from 2 figures to 3 figures. You've really
Every
2 statues.
element of it was revised many times.
Right.
Pretty much every element, I would have to say. And there's no detail too small for someone to object to. Stanton's hair, you know, Stanton's lap, that I actually did alter. It was thought that it was not modest enough the way her skirt draped across her knees. And I raised the lap so it wasn't so deep and brought her knees closer in. A lot of things change, but that is typical because you're creating something for other people. You're definitely creating an artwork. It has to satisfy my own sense of what works and what is beautiful and what is meaningful, but it's got to work for other people. And if you get critiques, you have to kind of let them sink in and interpret them in your own way and try to meet those criticisms.
We got an answer. Alice Hayes says, I'm involved in the Women's
Oh, yes.
Portrait Art Project in Ridgefield Town Hall. And she's very interested in art and suffrage. Well, next time I go to Ridgefield, I live in Greenwich, I will look for your women's portrait at the town hall.
It's a wonderful series of paintings. I think it's all the women who work in town hall by different artists, and it's really very lovely and a nice addition to the town.
Is it a permanent portrait?
I hope so. I don't know.
Good. I hope so too.
Yeah. Pam, what's next for Monumental Women, and how can individuals contribute? Yeah.
Ah, my favorite question. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, as you notice, I've mentioned monumentalwomen.org several times in our discussion. And if you go to our website, the donation page is right there. And I thank you so much. Anybody who's thinking of that, I mean, everything's tax deductible. In addition to being a nonprofit, we are a charity as well. And you'll see on the donation page, we have a gold seal for the group. So thank you for anybody who might be considering that. And in terms of what's next, the brief bullet point kind of things I said in my presentation, that if we raise enough money, we will do, which is not only create that toolkit for communities that want to build a statue on their own, but also to get women's history books into every public school library in New York City, and also create that women's history trail throughout all 5 boroughs of New York. So we have a lot of things in addition to a list that we'll be coming up with on more statues down the road. But for now, we want to try and encompass a lot of different things. And if you also go to our website, you'll see that we have a Put Her on a Pedestal education program for young people, where there's a template and information that young people can draw their own statue and figure out who they want on a pedestal. And we talked about the talking statues part of it, which we're so grateful for all those great actors who voiced that, but different components and figuring out different ways to get women's history out there and also make it creative and fun. But thank you so much for your question and your donation.
I have a question for Meredith from Michelle Jenny. She wants to know, was less complicated to have a memorial to women as opposed to women's rights?
Michelle Jenny is from the Boston Women's Heritage Trail, which is kind of, I think, a model for what Monumental Women is going to do in New York City. Boy, I don't think it was less complicated, but it was a different era. And I think even in the 7 years that this monument took, attitudes changed and evolved and got, I think, more heated. Probably because of this presidential administration making all attitudes more heated and everyone more allergic to everyone else. I think it got touchier. It was harder to believe that we could represent everyone who wanted to be represented the way they wanted to be represented or want to be represented now. Boston was in a way less complicated. But there were other issues. There was more pressure to make clear that this was a contemporary artwork. And in fact, when that monument was unveiled, the Boston Globe did a very nice feature story on it with beautiful photos and showing all the people mobbing it and having a wonderful time. And then their art critic published a review with, again, very beautiful photos talking about how ugly it was and how Boston didn't need more statuary and how statuary was passé and doesn't work and doesn't serve any purpose. So the Boston Globe was kind of fighting itself, and then another local paper published a review calling it a cancerous excrescence on Commonwealth Avenue. And then there was silence for, I would say, 8 to 10 years. Nothing in the art press, nothing. So this is a very different situation. This has received a lot of attention, and it seems to be be taken seriously as an artwork, even by the contemporary art world. So Boston was less complicated, perhaps politically and symbolically. But I think now it would be just as complicated.
We have a question here about the weight of the monument. If you know what the actual weight of the monument is.
Rounded off, the
Rounded
bronze, yeah, the bronze section is monolithic. It's all welded together and it weighs 7,000 pounds.
Wow. Wow.
And the pedestal is even heavier.
Yeah.
And I have a question for you. Did you design the pedestal, or was that designed by Buyer Blender Bell? Or
No, I designed the pedestal.
oh, you
That
did.
was,
Okay.
that was another area that was very heavily critiqued.
And it's
It shouldn't look too old fashioned. It shouldn't be this, it shouldn't be that. Yeah. So
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful pedestal.
I just see Marilyn Carroll's comment,
here we go.
and she thanks us, but she also is from the League of Women Voters of Ridgefield. And this is an incredible organization, League of Women Voters. It's a nonpartisan group, and it's a very interesting origin story that right when women got the vote, or the 19th Amendment was passed, this organization was formed because people should not just go into a voting booth uninformed. Well, this organization, League of Women Voters, was set up so people could cast informed votes. So kudos to the League that has also celebrated its 100th anniversary. And we are on the cusp of an election, November 3rd. So the League is an incredibly important source of information, but not only issues, but registering to vote and the practicality of voting.
Well, that's a nice segue into my thank yous for today, because this program is also part of our Votes for Women series. That's a townwide celebration of the passing of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. I'd like to thank you, Pam and Colleen and Meredith, for a wonderful presentation and this opportunity to ask you questions about the whole thing. I'd also like to thank the library for its support in our ARTalk series. In addition, we'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Ridgefield Guild of Artists and the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum. Our next Art Talk will take place on Sunday afternoon at 2 p.m., November 22nd, and will feature Paul Estefeu, Director of Contemporary Art for Hollis Taggart Art Gallery in New York, who will talk about the dynamics of the New York City art market. For a full listing of our 2021 Art Talks, please go to ridgefieldlibrary.org and click on the events section and go to Art in the Library. Thank you all for attending our program today. We wish to see you at future Art Talks, and please have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ridgefield.
Thank you.
Thank you.